Hello and welcome to Novara FM. My name is Eleanor Penny. The top brass of Keir Starmer's Labour Party has spent the last 8 months lending their support for Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. And as campaigning in the general election gets underway, the leadership have further cracked down on the left in the party. The internationalist left, who have been consistently critical of UK foreign policy, have found themselves often hauled before tribunals or booted out of the party entirely. The hundreds of thousands of people who joined the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn might be a little bewildered by what can be seen as a sharp, even unprecedented rightwards tack in foreign policy. But is it really so surprising? Is Starmer's hawkishness the exception or the rule? What is the history of Labour's approach to foreign policy? As a party of government with its hand on the levers of the British state, it has been a major institution of colonial rule from the early 20th century right through to the present day. So how has that shaped the party? And what kinds of politics are possible under the banner of the Labour Rose? I asked David Waring, a lecturer in international relations at the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex, to tell me more about the ins and outs of that history and how it's shaped our present moment. David Waring has written widely on history, colonialism, foreign policy and the Middle East for outlets including the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Humanist and the London Review of Books. His book, AngloArabia, Why Gulf Wealth Matters to Britain, was published by Polity Press in 2018. We talked about the partition of the Indian subcontinent, counter-insurgencies in the Middle East and Malaya, and the hopes for the modern internationalist left. Hi David, welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So there's so much to get into. We're going to be covering, over 100 years of history of both Britain and the Labour Party in specifics. But let's lay out some context before we dive in. So the Labour Party, or rather the constellation of different organisations that then coalesce into what we now know as the Labour Party, come around basically at the height of the British Empire. Can you tell us a little bit about the sort of state of play of the empire at the time? Kind of what were the key concerns of the rulers of empire? Like, what were they looking towards? What were they worried about? What were they managing at the time?
Yeah. So, the British Empire plays an enormous role historically in creating the structures of global capitalism today. Bringing large swathes of the world into a global capitalist system in which Britain is the sort of the leading player. And that's the case from the Industrial Revolution through the 1800s. Britain's a kind of leading industrial power. What's happening in the late 19th century, so just before the emergence of the Labour Party, is that other states are catching up, other big capitalist states are catching up and overtaking Britain. So in particular, Germany and United States. So Britain's share of global trade, global exports, Britain's share of industrial production, all of that is declining relative to its sort of capitalist competitors, as it were. So while Britain still has this enormous colonial empire, it's less the dominant player and more one of a series of, major industrial nations. It's certainly the leading imperial power. But, there is this kind of relative change of, balance that's happening. And so that's one of the big challenges. How do we deal with, we, not me, how do we, being the people running the empire, deal with this increasing competition, inter-imperialist competition? A key concern, for example, as we go into the early 20th century, a kind of long-term strategic principle is that Britain will have a navy that's larger than the two next largest navies to maintain its sort of dominance of the oceans. So British sea power is key to the British Empire. And that's getting harder and harder to maintain particularly because of the growth of German naval power. So these are the kind of preoccupations they've got. On the one hand, in terms of sheer territorial breadth, the British Empire is at its peak and will get bigger. But there is this interstate competition as well. And unbeknownst to people at the centre of power at the time, what was coming next was 30 years of catastrophe from 1914 to 1945, 2 world wars and a depression in the middle, which really deal a hammer blow to this whole system. They don't know that yet, but they know that this inter-imperial competition is going to be a real problem.
So there is this uncertain relationship, both at the time and also in the way that we talk about it, between the sort of domestic working classes, if you like, the people who are like doing the labour within the bounds of the imperial metropolis, and people in the colonial periphery. So can you tell us about, I guess, what is the Labour Party, or maybe the Labour movement's attitudes towards empire in broad terms during this period? How are they thinking about, what are in essence, or people who are in essence their class compatriots, but it's often not kind of cashed out in those terms?
I mean, the word you used earlier, constellation, I think is right, in that there's a bunch of competing trends and positions within this movement that's coalescing into the Labour Party. You will find people who are genuinely anti-imperialist in terms of particular moments like the Boer War, anti-imperialist or anti-empire as a phenomenon more generally. But you will also find people who are not just accepting of empire as a fact of life. Britain has an empire, but like keen on it. They like the idea, like the Fabians, for example. Really buy into the whole sort of liberal imperialism ideology. Like the empire is fundamentally a force for civilization, a force for good. They use this term like the sort of guardianship of the non-adult races to characterize the role that Britain, the sort of tutelage role that Britain can play in the colonies. So their kind of reformist approach to socialism or social democracy is, when it manifests itself externally in terms of the empire, really, it's very kind of consistent with liberal imperialism, which pre-existed Labour. I mean, that's part of the tradition, fits in perfectly with pre-existing liberal imperialism. Like, it wasn't, when we think about the empire, we think of these days, hopefully with people like us anyway, we think about the violence and the exploitation and the subjugation and the white supremacy, which were all inherent to empire, which were all inherent to the British Empire, central to its nature. And we think of that generally as bad stuff that we can't reconcile with our values of egalitarianism, social justice, etc., etc. But it's worth remembering that at the time, many of the people who were invested in imperialism saw themselves as enlightened people and good people who were trying to do good in the world, and saw the empire as a force for good. And that's the case for 19th century bourgeois liberals. And there is a significant trend within Labour at that time, manifesting in terms of the Fabians, which is perfectly, which slots into that, part of the discourse and part of the imperial political culture quite easily. And then, of course, we can run a thread from that right to, Blair in the 90s.
Hopefully that's exactly what we will be doing today, right? But can you tell us a bit about how those kinds of attitudes start to shape the kind of strategic priorities, or like what people imagine socialism to be, or socialism to consist in at the time?
There's an ambivalent kind of relationship, I think, between other parts of the labour movement and empire, in that on the one hand, the sort of iniquities and violence of empire is sort of recognised, and at the same time, there's a kind of, Britain, there's no sort of domestic British economy as opposed to the empire. It's all one system. And to the extent that you're part of the British economy, you're part of a colonial economy, an imperial economy. And a huge amount of industrial production is predicated on markets and, worldwide. To the extent that it's a military power, a huge amount of industrial production is predicated on creating that military power. And so large swathes of the working class have have a stake in an imperial system. So it's not necessarily the case that a kind of a Labour movement, a Labour Party built from the grassroots will be anti-colonial, will be anti-imperial. Some parts of that working class base might be, and other parts might not be, or might at least be conflicted about it. And again, you can trace the thread to the debates we have these days about arms sales to Saudi or Israel or whoever else, and the argument always comes back that, but what about the jobs? What about the jobs in the northeast, which would be lost if we stopped arming Saudi? So all that stuff is still there right from the start.
We're nudging towards a period in history where the first honest to God Labour Party government gets elected, and at this point, it's maybe useful to do a little kind of table setting maybe in terms of, okay, what should we be talking about when we're talking about the movement of colonial government and how it gets shaped, right? Should we be talking about the Labour Party doing something? Should we be talking about Britain doing something, the British Empire, British capital? Like, how would you start to frame these debates in ways that kind of maybe are useful for understanding our current moment?
The British Empire is not a totalitarian system. It's a reasonably complex system of power in which there are various component parts. There's the British state, and there's the financial capital, which really thrives in the British colonial system. There's industrial capital. There's the navy and the armed forces, and there's these governing parties, Liberals and Tories, and then increasingly Labour coming through in the interwar period. This kind of rotating, management class for the British state. I mean, Labour evolves from the origins that we talked about into becoming one of the governing parties of the British state. Now, there's going to be differences in terms of interest between who wants what kind of policy at any given moment, in any given instance. But there's a kind of collective, this is a kind of collective project, the British Empire. And we have to add to that the intellectual and subjective kind of aspect of it as well. The belief in white supremacy, the belief in, the European civilization, Western civilization, or Anglo-Saxon civilization, as they thought of it at the time. It's a confluence of beliefs, material interests, a range of different but complementary material interests in terms of state, in terms of capital. And the Labour Party kind of starts to plug into that. It starts to become domesticated, if you like, by that system. So if you think about how the tensions I described a moment ago, how they play out in that process, I mean, to the extent that Labour becomes a party of government through two short-lived minority governments in the 20s and into the early 30s, and then as a partner in the wartime coalition during the Second World War, Labour is gradually becoming a party of government in a capitalist state, shaped by class relations, a party of government in an imperial state, characterised by violence, exploitation, domination, white supremacy. And it gets brought into that, domesticated by it. Like, you do not get to participate in that system unless you adopt some of the characteristics. So, to some extent, Labour reforms the system that it becomes a governing party within. But to a large extent, the system reforms Labour, or, domesticates Labour and makes, a significant chunk of the Labour Party, the leadership, reconcile to that. Because, there's a clear tension between being a party whose raison d'etre is egalitarianism, social justice, enlightened kind of values, whatever you might mean by that, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a governing party of a power structure that is literally characterised by violence, exploitation, and white supremacy. Those two things are, there's a contradiction there, to put it incredibly mildly. And what happens in this process of domestication of the Labour Party by the British state, by the British colonial state, is that effectively you have people within the movement party who are able to reconcile, who are able to sustain the cognitive dissonance, who are able to reconcile their supposed egalitarian social justice type values with what they have to do, what it requires to run an empire, and those who can't reconcile themselves to it. And the people who can reconcile themselves to it are the ones that tend to lead the Labour Party, the ones who tend to be in cabinet, and the ones who can't reconcile themselves to it are the ones who are criticising from the backbenches or from the rank and file. And so that kind of conflict, if we're thinking about the Labour Party's place within this kind of pluralistic power structure of all these different component parts and how Labour works as a component within that system, the effect that it has on Labour is that you have this tension, this almost a permanent state of political conflict playing out between those who have reconciled themselves to the nature of empire and think that it's actually egalitarian and good to run a capitalist empire, and those who don't. And you end up with that, and we've as a left, lived through a modern manifestation of that conflict. And it puts the Labour leadership at kind of the leading edge of things like anti-communism and a wider McCarthyism and against the left generally, because it's within the Labour Party that the sharp edge of the state hits what passes for progressive mass politics in this country. It's within the Labour Party that happens.
Stop me if you've heard this one before, huh?
Yeah, well, quite. Yeah.
So when we're talking about these figures that rise to the top of the Labour Party, that then the people who become memorialised, that then become ascended to heroes of the Labour Party, heroes of the Labour movement, basically because of the way in which sort of memorialisation works. We can point to people like Nye Bevan, for instance, Attlee, these figureheads of the post-war government that who become integral to the way in which the Labour Party is thought of and the way in which this kind of post-war period more generally is, I think it's fair to say, romanticised in terms of formulating an aspirational imaginary of what Labour is, what Labour does, what Labour can do. Tell us about kind of what's going on in the empire that, again, sort of provides these contradictions between, what's happening domestically and what might be going on in terms of the violence of this colonial system.
Yeah. I mean, the kind of romanticisation of that government is understandable because it built a legacy domestically which continued to make people's lives better for decades beyond its departure from office, and we still benefit from it, in terms of the NHS and things like that to a large extent now.
Right.
He says, because he knows he's going to say things which some people aren't going to like about this government. So it's worth getting that out of the way, and that's not just throat clearing. I mean it, but this goes alongside and is not necessarily divisible from what Labour did between 45 and 52. As a governing party within a colonial imperial system. So if you think about that period, this is really a kind of a shift from one chapter of British international history to another chapter. If you think about what I described a moment ago, and this is a phrase I'm taking from Eric Hobsbawm, this age of catastrophe between 1914 and 1945, and the kind of hammer blow that this deals to the British economy and to Britain's capacity to run an empire. What you're left with in 45, when Labour comes in for the first time with a comfortable majority as a stable government, is a big set of challenges from the point of view of the imperial metropole, in terms of how we're going to maintain Britain's status as a world power, given the huge economic costs that we've paid over the past 30 years and the past sort of 6 years especially. How do we maintain as much of Britain's status and power in the world system? And it was Labour that was there in government in that formative moment, shaping to sort of a post-war international system, as well as a post-war British foreign relations, the way the British state was structured into the international system in the post-war era. Labour were the ones who were in office, shaping all that. So if you think, for example, about, the fact that a decision has clearly been made, more or less consciously, more or less willingly, to accept that the US is going to play the leading role in global capitalism, and like this kind of managerial role within the system. Capitalism is not just about markets; it's about states and it's about violence to hold this whole system in place. And the British don't have the capacity to do that at a global level anymore. The Americans do. And Britain, being a capitalist state, knows that capitalism has to be enforced, with violence, with state power. The Americans have the capacity to do it. Britain doesn't. The Labour government is are there in the driving seat at the moment when that American leadership is acknowledged, number one, and number two, structured into the system. So the kind of system the world system that's created in that moment to manage foreign economic relations between and foreign relations generally between the major states through this institutional framework, the UN, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, NATO, this whole kind of lattice work of international institutions and structures. Labour really kind of front and centre in terms of, let's put this together. This is good for us as a second-tier power because it helps to, the biggest powers will always kind of push against this kind of rules-based international order because it restrains them to a degree, constrains them. Second-tier powers and smaller powers are likely to be more keen on that sort of thing because, it gives them a place, it gives them a seat at the table. So Labour like that, and they're there in this really, really important moment. I mean, there's other sort of aspects as well. The drive for the atomic bomb in this moment. That's Labour pushing for that, both as a kind of quote unquote deterrent against against the Soviet Union. But I mean, another really key aspect of this, because the Soviet Union is not about to invade Britain after, irrespective of the conditions, but particularly after, the devastation of World War II and 20 million Soviet dead, and all the rest of it.
Stop hitting him, he's already dead kind of thing.
Yeah, so it doesn't have the capacity to be as massively expansionist power in a way that, Germany was 6 years earlier. But so I want to take that idea of deterrence against the Soviet Union with a slight pinch of salt. But nevertheless, that's one of the rationales. But another rationale is, again, how do we maintain our status and prestige and power in the world system? Having the atomic bomb will be a big part of that. Again, it's Labour who do that. And so the 1945 government was really like a key author of this neo-imperial moment that we've been living in since 1945. And perhaps we can talk in a moment about how Labour dealt with the process of decolonisation. But that all happens, that process, within this structure, within this new, in IR scholarship, we call it international relations scholarship, we call it liberal institutionalism, regulating international relations between major states through this big institutional framework. And Labour put that together. Labour government puts that together. And a key figure in this whole process is the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, who is a staunch anti-communist, who is committed to the British, really committed to the British Empire as a good thing, as something that, Britain deserves this status and should have this status in the world system. He's also, a staunch anti-communist, and he sees the USSR as not just, a highly repressive system for the people who live under it, including people in its sort of imperial near abroad, in Eastern Europe, but also as an expansionist power, which is a threat to what he would term Western civilization. In other words, our empire is good, your empire is bad.
Right.
And this guy plays a really leading role in all the stuff I've described, setting up of NATO, the drive for the atomic bomb. Not that he did this all single-handed, but he had a lot of latitude as a foreign secretary. And this is someone it's just worth mentioning him because he's still a kind of venerated figure by the Labour right today. They see him as kind of a touchstone almost for their own ideology, their kind of Atlanticist ideology, pro-US ideology, seeing British power as a force for good in the world, characterising it in terms of defence against dictators, or at least the dictators we don't like. And to the extent that the Labour right are kind of have a near imperial characteristic about them, and a kind of militaristic aspect to their, British militarism is central to their politics. He's their kind of, is a kind of lodestar for them even now.
So we've talked before on this show with Gurminder Bamra about the key role that the wealth of empire played in funding the welfare state in such a way that it could resolve the domestic class contradictions somewhat and quell or quiet the threat of a more organized communism or socialism without touching the profit margins of British capital too much, at least. It's not a comfortable point, right? To talk about the role of colonialism in the formation of social democracy, because, social democracy comes along with a lot of things that we like, right? We want to fund healthcare, we want to fund childcare, et cetera, et cetera. How do you go about historicizing that in a way that I guess, allows us to talk about what horizons we might want to push for as an internationalist left?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of hinted at this earlier, didn't we? Because I talked about the contradictions between, on the one hand, being a party of egalitarianism and social justice, and on the other hand, being a party of government in a colonial system, which is which worldly contradicts those kind of principles. But also noting that there are elements of the British working class, large elements, which benefited from empire. Now, we really get into this point now in the post-45 Labour government setting up modern British social democracy, and that moment of social democracy between 45 and 79. As you said, the word you use, uncomfortable, is exactly right, because the two go hand in hand. That's the reality of it. I mean, from the Americans' point of view, on the one hand, they wanted the old colonial empires to be broken up, because the old colonial empires, the French, the British, were closed economic systems. And the Americans, in their position of economic strength post-World War II, relative economic strength as well as absolute, really wanted to break into those systems. They wanted to, be able to export into those parts of the world. They wanted to be able to export, capital, export goods, on the one hand. But on the other, and they also saw themselves, they saw themselves as different from old school, colonialists in the traditional sense. Didn't see themselves as imperial, even though they clearly were. But in that moment, they recognised that it was worth maintaining British power in the world, and in geopolitical terms, to push back against the Soviets, but also to push back against anti-colonial nationalism, and to have a strong Britain in the world system. Britain would need to reconstruct its economy, and Britain would need to resolve what you mentioned the class contradictions within the British state. Whereas there's this mobilised working class who've delivered a landslide majority for Labour and are demanding a better life. How do you square all that? Well, the Americans were effectively took the position that, okay, you can keep your empire for the time being at least, and basically exploit it to rebuild your economy and to resolve these domestic contradictions that you're experiencing. And so, to the extent that the British economy at home was capable of delivering these things that the people rightly demanded and wanted and deserved, that can be attributed in no small part I don't want to say no social democracy without empire, because other social democracies emerged in Europe without empire. But nevertheless, in this context, economic stability in Britain was guaranteed to a large extent by its the fact that it's not just a domestic economy, it's a colonial economy, it's an imperial economy. So one of the big threats to the British economy in this moment is the weakness of the pound sterling, particularly against the dollar. So how do you maintain the value of sterling against the dollar at a time when you're having to import massively from the United States, for example? You need exports. You need exports from a sterling. Britain has a sterling area. It's not just Britain that uses the pound. It's a large chunk of its empire uses the pound as well. And so exports from not just Britain, but the Middle East, parts of the Middle East, Malaya, are sterling exports, which will earn you dollars and maintain your balance of payments and maintain the strength of the pound, which in turn keeps your economy stable and helps you to push through this whole process, right? Quite apart from the revenues that are generated and the taxes that can be levied on the various companies, whether it's BP and what was then the AngloArabia Oil Company, which became BP in Iran, or whether it's the British exporters of rubber and tin from Malaya, really key commodities. And so in this moment, Britain is able to and does keep hold of large chunks of its empire because of the commodity exports that it can, generate from that empire, which in turn help it maintain its balance of payments, is revenue generating, and that helps Britain to be in a position where it can create this whole welfare state. And Labour are the government within that is managing that whole process. So if you think about a couple of examples, which I've hinted at, Iran, where Britain doesn't have a formal colonial control over Iran, but it's, the colonial systems are quite complex. There's the areas that are painted pink on the map, but there's these other bits which you have like de facto control over as well. And Iran is one of those countries where the oil industry in Iran is a huge part of the economy, and it's owned by the AngloArabia Oil Company, which we now know as BP. Now, the Iranians, they have a kind of democratic parliamentary system, and the guy in charge at the time, the Prime Minister Mossadegh, is, I guess he'd be described in modern terms as like an economic populist or an economic nationalist. And he gets this crazy idea, which obviously the British Labour Party is never going to accept, that you should nationalise key industries in service of the general population. So he nationalises the oil industry, the Iranian oil industry, on the premise that perhaps Iran's national wealth should be used for the benefit of the general population who are living in serious poverty. The deal at the time is that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company extracts the oil, refines it, sells it, enjoys the profits, and the Iranian government gets like a little bit of pocket money. And a large proportion of the Iranian population live in poverty because of that, and the British state and the British capital is enjoying this wealth. So when this nationalisation happens,
when is that?
So this is in 1950, 51. I can't remember the exact date of it. So this is right at the sort of end of the Labour government of that period. It's there's later on, as people who know the history will know, there's a coup which overthrows the elected government, Mossadegh's government, and turns the Shah of Iran into a kind of just straightforward dictator. And it's a coup that's instigated by the CIA and MI6 and, using sort of sympathetic elements within Iranian civil society. And it's Churchill who comes back into power after Labour are kicked out in 52, who's a leading figure in that coup on the British side. But the process starts under Labour. It's Labour who are in government when the Iranian oil industry is nationalised. It's the Labour government which blockades Iran to stop it selling its own oil because they've had the temerity to take control of that oil industry their oil industry in their country from the British.
Gosh.
It's the British who do that, which of course is incredibly damaging to the Iranian, and it's this collective punishment of Iran as a nation, of the Iranian population, make the people suffer, squeeze them in order to put pressure on the government. And that sets the scene for the later coup. The other example is Malaya, which is which has this huge rubber and tin industry and other commodities as well, minerals, etc. And then that export industry is a British colonial possession, and it's dominated. These got the kind of mining industry, rubber and tin industry are dominated by British commercial interests. Now there's an insurgency against British rule led by the Chinese portion of the population. It's a communist insurgency. I mean, the reality is that a lot of anti-colonial nationalism and anti-colonial insurgencies in the South at the time were communist or had communist elements. And it's a mixture of just nationalism, anti-colonial nationalism, and communism. And it was expedient and useful for capitalist powers, colonial powers, to portray all of this as communist and all of this as a communist conspiracy, with the strings being pulled by the Chinese and the Russians. But often it was just people wanting to throw out colonial exploiters and, raise their standard of living through independence. So this is in the late 40s, this insurgency happens, and it goes on into the 50s, into the Tory government, but it's Labour who started it off, the counter-insurgency campaign, which is characterised, as all these counter-insurgency campaigns are, by collective punishment, destruction of villages, aerial bombing, this particularly horrible policy they had of destroying people's villages and crops and rounding them up by force into new villages which are surrounded by barbed wire, and they're effectively prison camps for the entire population. Right? And the American sort of strategic Hamlet, in quotes, programs that they used in Vietnam were inspired by this policy that the British had in Malaya. That counterinsurgency campaign works. They defeat the insurgency. It goes on for quite a while. As I say, it goes on well into the 50s. But it's Labour that starts it. And it's part of a general picture led by people like Ernest Bevin, but also Clement Attlee as well, who gave Bevin a lot of latitude, as I say, as a foreign secretary. But fundamentally, he's still the prime minister for this whole period. It's these people who, that kind of violence, whether in Malaya, whether in Iran, in respect of Iran, is part of this wider project of maintaining Britain as a global economic power, maintaining the right kind of capitalist relations. And it's, at the same time, it's their domestic concerns as a Labour Party, resolving the class contradictions that you mentioned, delivering for their base. All these things, all this stuff gets stitched together, and so it's hard to pull apart. And again, I'm not going to say that it's impossible to have this, social democracy without imperialism, without colonialism, without counterinsurgency, without exploitation. But it just so happens that in this instance, all this stuff is inextricably linked.
The first two Labour majority governments, 45 to 51, 64 to 70, these coincide with, as you're explaining, these big structural shifts in UK foreign relations, right? There's a continuity of aims, of goals. There's a lot of continuity in terms of institutions, but the situation on the ground is shifting, not least in response to insurgent independence movements, insurgents of communist and socialist movements within the colonial periphery. So can you tell us about how Labour oversees maybe a change in strategy? We can talk about this as a sort of decolonial moment or a recolonial moment, depending on which way you slice it.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about it in terms of fundamental overarching principles, like the recognition that it's not going to be possible to maintain an empire to this extent any longer, because of the cost of maintaining these kind of military commitments, like having military commitments everywhere, having troops everywhere, having naval bases everywhere, air bases everywhere. Not literally everywhere, but
as close to everywhere as makes
and certainly for a small island on the off the coast of Eurasia, which is what Britain is. It's not a major land power with a population of hundreds of millions. And so Britain really is overextended in this moment. And, there is a recognition of the economic realities, and it's a recognition which has arrived at painfully and slowly I say painfully, painfully from the point of view of the kind of, chauvinists who think that it's right for Britain to have an empire. But, it's arrived at painfully from their point of view and arrived at slowly, but it is arrived at this recognition that we've got that Britain has to reduce its presence in the world, that there's going to be a degree of decolonisation. But within that, I think the principle fundamentally is the decolonisation, or with the shrinking of Britain's role, should happen as little as possible. It should happen to the extent that it has to, because the status quo is unaffordable. But it should also only happen to the extent that British interests can still be preserved. So what are we going to leave behind? If we have to leave, we have to make sure that what's left in this country or that country is going to be a reliable partner. That the people who are going to be in charge going forward can be trusted to maintain the key things that empires care about. And generally, this is the kind of shift from direct colonialism to near imperialism. That, fundamentally, you don't need to run the entire country from, you don't need to run the education system and all the public infrastructure and blah, blah, blah. What you really need is the right kind of economic relations, whereby you've got access to markets that, export markets, and you've got the ability to invest. You've got the ability to extract raw materials, etc., and access to cheap labour, and also the country's foreign policy, foreign and military policy, geostrategic policy is going to be basically aligned with you. They're going to be in your camp rather than their camp. But you can, to the extent that you can leave a local government to get on with that, you manage capitalist relations on our behalf. You manage your geostrategic posture on our behalf. And as long as you're aligned with us in those terms, you can do it wherever you want domestically. That's near imperialism. And to the extent that the British pull back, they try and maintain that what's left behind, make sure that what's left behind is those kind of regimes. So if you think about one of the key moments in all of this is within the kind of 64 to 70 Labour government. The big decision, kind of painful for the imperialists and contentious for a period decision in this moment was the withdrawal from quote-unquote east of Suez. Will we maintain a military presence, a colonial imperial presence, formally speaking, east of the Suez Canal, like into the Middle East, Southeast Asia, etc., etc. We will continue to have a major base in Singapore. We will continue to treat the Persian Gulf as a kind of British lake dominated by British naval forces with colonial kind of protectorates in places like Kuwait, what's now the UAE, Qatar, Oman, etc., etc. The decision is taken after the umpteenth currency crisis in 1967. The Labour government at the time takes a decision that, look, we're going to have to make cuts. We're going to have to recognise that we can't do everything anymore. And the big strategic decision at that point is taken to withdraw from east of Suez. Tories who are in opposition hate it. The Americans hate it as well, actually. The Americans remonstrate with the British for a time at least and say, look, we've got enough problems at the moment with Vietnam. We need you to be doing your bit as a partner in this wider imperial system. The job of running the Persian Gulf was kind of delegated to you. You can't just pull out of it. And the British have to explain to them, look, we really can't do this anymore. We don't have the capacity for it. And so the question then becomes, who's going to be left behind? And, we're getting very much into my specialist area now in terms of Britain's relationship with the Gulf states. This is the moment where Britain is kind of the midwife to the emerging state system in the Gulf, where you're making sure against nationalist forces who are, almost none of these people are communists. It's just
disgusting.
they're just nationalists.
Yeah.
And this is what really gives the lie to this whole "we're just fighting communism" bullshit that kind of justified British foreign relations throughout this whole Cold War period. Like, you can't reduce what happened between 1945, 47 and 1991 to the Cold War, because in the South, it's not just communism, it's also nationalism. It's just anti-colonial nationalism, just people wanting to be free of empire. And, that was the case in the Middle East, where communism wasn't communist parties were present in the South of the Arabian Peninsula. There's a big communist party in Iraq, but generally speaking, it's anti-colonial nationalism, Arab nationalism. And in the Gulf, Britain tries to make sure that those forces are kept down, and really regressive, reactionary, monarchical regimes, which we still know today, are in place. So when the British pull back, these people can be trusted to maintain the orientation towards Western power geostrategically, and also to maintain the sort of favourable capitalist relations with the British as well. And that's one example of the overriding kind of the overriding kind of picture. Make sure that this tradition and this shrinking of this transition, and this shrinking of British power does as little damage to British capitalist power and geopolitical power as possible by leaving behind these kind of allies. In other instances, it's chaotic. In other instances, it's it doesn't work out well. And Britain is dealing with all of this from a position of weakness. So if you think about Israel, if you think about partition in India, these were just like desperate scuttles for the exit. It wasn't a controlled transition in any way, shape or form. With India, I think Labour's position generally was, well, there should be Indian independence within wider British sort of international structures. But when it came to it, there was no way they had the power to enforce what was going to happen next in India. And they were being driven out.
Right. We should say at this point that it's no coincidence that you get the rise of independence movements and the rising cost of empire at the same time. Like, part of what an independence movement does is it makes empire a real hassle and a real cost to maintain for the imperial masters, if you like.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a pincer movement between, historically speaking, between what Britain has undergone as a capitalist power through 2 world wars and a depression in the middle. And also, as you absolutely rightly point out, the independence movements raise the cost of maintaining control. If everyone's just quiet and passive, it's easy. If people are trying to throw you out, the whole point is that you can't afford the cost of fighting against them. You have to accept what it is that they're demanding. And, there was no way that Britain had the capacity to maintain its control over India. And if you can't maintain capacity, if you don't have the capacity to maintain control over India, and you don't have the power to shape the outcome, then there is a kind of air of, let's just leave them to it. I mean, if you think about how partition played out and the horrific violence that played out in partition, when India is, partitioned from what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, there's a casualness to the way the British approached this. They send this British official over to India to just draw a line on a map. He barely does any research. I'm not sure he even goes to the places on the ground which are going to be divided. And he draws a line on the map which divides communities, and which, this process feeds into, because we can't blame the Labour Party solely for this. The British colonial state has been playing divide and rule with the Hindu and Muslim populations in India for decades. This comes as a culmination of that. Draw a line in the map, right, there's your Pakistan, there's your India, we're off, see you later, you make the best of that. And it's an absolute catastrophe. And Labour, I mean, that happens under the Labour government. It's in 1947. It happens under a Labour government. This official, colonial official, Ratcliffe, I think his name is sent there by the Labour government. Labour have to take some responsibility for that, I think, for the way in which that process was handled. And then the other kind of scuttle for the exit is in Palestine, obviously, where, again, you've got, on the one hand, as part of the Zionist project, it's the growth of the basis for a Jewish state. The basis for the state of Israel has been laid under British colonial control from 1917 onwards. And, pushback from the Palestinians in terms of the Arab Revolt in the late 30s. And just the cost of the cost of dealing with this conflict is just not one the British are prepared to bear any longer. It's becoming harder to deal with the fact that on the one hand, you've committed yourself to creating this state of Israel, not out of any concern for Jewish people in the slightest, because it's the strategic value of having a dependent state in this important part of Jewish strategic real estate, this kind of, there you are in the Middle East or heartlands of the planet, just off on the periphery of that, next to the Suez Canal, you'll have what one British official called a little Jewish Ulster in a hostile sea of Arabs. This was the idea. I mean, the British state was committed to that, but it's got too hard. The Palestinians are revolting against it. The wider Arab states, who you suddenly have to care about a bit more now because of the oil, et cetera, and because of the danger they may shift into the other geopolitical camp, you've got a conflict happening, and you can either manage that, which involves a huge commitment of resources, or you can throw your hands up and leave, and that's what the British do. Again, in 1947, just, they scuttle for the exits, they hand the file back to the UN and say, okay, you guys do with that, lots of luck. And next thing that happens is the Nakba. And, I don't want to say that Britain leaving a colonial possession is a bad thing. It's obviously a good thing, But at the same time, there is a casualness in the treatment of the peoples in these countries, which is basically a sense of you've either outlived your usefulness or you become too costly for us, and we literally don't care what happens next. We're off. So the instrumentalization of, of all of these peoples, I think is what's happening there. But it fits into the wider picture, and it gives us a sense as well of the fact that this is not a smooth transitional process. A lot of it is messy. A lot of it is the British either giving up or being thrown out of various places, by anti-colonial movements.
So let's skip ahead a little bit in history, and let's think about New Labour under Blair. One of the things, of course, that Blair is known for, especially now, is his foreign policy, or rather the kind of new shape of British foreign relations that emerges in the late 1990s through to the 2000s as that kind of cementing of the so-called special relationship and the doubling down, and certainly in conflicts in the Middle East, really gets going. Can you talk us through what the state of Labour foreign relations looks like, and how it connects with these sort of imperial forces?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about Blair and New Labour and their foreign relations, I think there's two key strands to identify, two things that are happening. If we situate this historically in the 90s. So on the one hand, we're in the moment of liberal triumphalism, right? The Soviet Union has collapsed, but also social democracy has collapsed in the West. So you've now got, neoliberal economics pushed through by Thatcher and Reagan, taken up by Blair and Clinton, and pushed out into this new sort of terrain where the Soviet Union and the communist system is collapsing. And there's this sense of liberal euphoria and pro-Western euphoria. There's no one to stop us now creating the world that we want economically, politically, geostrategically. So, in that transitional moment from formal colonialism to neo-imperialism that we talked about a moment ago, one of the barriers was, Soviet power and the Soviet allies, but this is all collapsing now. And that aggressive sense of possibilities is one that shapes neoconservatism in the US. And, Blair isn't far off being a neoconservative himself. The idea that, this is history unfolding in the teleological way as we liberals expect it to and as it should, and we're going to drive that forward through military interventions, et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening is that, and it's not too dissimilar to the moment we're in now, where you've got the right wing of the Labour Party is in the lead of the party, and it's trying to prove itself to key centres of power. This is always made out to be just proving itself to the electorate. It's proving itself to right-wing swing voters, certainly, but also proving itself to the gutter press and, and the more sort of paleoconservative press, and also to the United States and other key centres of power, that you can trust us with British power in the world. And so I think Labour is, militaristic and aggressive in its foreign policy, partly because of this moment of liberal euphoria, but also partly because it's trying to prove itself, and it's making a virtue of proving itself, because these people believe in this stuff. Like, we are not the Labour left. We believe in, nuclear weapons and the Atlantic relationship, blah, blah, blah. Very, very similar to what we're seeing now. And then that feeds into what happens in the so-called War on Terror. So after the al-Qaeda attacks on New York and Washington in 2001, this is seen by the neoconservative government in the US as a huge opportunity to pursue a quite aggressive foreign policy. And to reshape the world, through military interventions. Like they do Afghanistan quite quickly, and they try and get it out of the way, almost leave its occupation there. And then they go for what they really want to go for, which is the Middle East, because the Middle East that's the oil heartland of the planet. That's where the huge proportion of the world's strategic oil reserves are, like 45% of the world's oil reserves are in the Middle East, gas reserves as well. That's just, it's a huge source of strategic power in the world system, which everyone, who has a serious interest in geopolitics understands. And this is a power grab, it's not the sort of shallow conspiracy theory approach to that is that they invaded Iraq to privatize the Iraqi oil industry and just give it to Western oil firms to make money out of. And there's an element of that, but the bigger element is having Western power sitting on top of the world's strategic oil reserves. And thereby having greater structural power in the world system, especially over rivals like China, for example, which is energy poor and energy hungry, and which now knows that the West is consolidating its position on top of the oil and gas reserves that it needs access to for its growth. So that's what's going on there. But of course, it's all dressed up in kind of, and this is going back to the point we made earlier of how this kind of cold geopolitical drive is, I don't want to say it's dressed up by it, but it's possible to put narratives on this sort of thing which can appeal to people who consider themselves liberal, like Blair. We're actually going to save the Iraqis from tyranny, and we're going to bring them democracy and prosperity, and we're going to bring them into the civilized world, And the more sort of harder geopolitical aspects will be taken care of above his pay grade by people like Dick Cheney, the vice president in the US, Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary at the time. But he will have this ideological approach to it, which the liberal imperialist, view of the whole thing. So he bought into that whole neoconservative project, that whole war on terror, in which fighting terrorism was almost used as a pretext to extend American geopolitical power. And he wanted Britain to be signed up to all of that and part of it as part of the strategy set down by Ernest Bevin et al. In the 40s of staying close to the US as part of Britain's greater sort of strategic approach. And so, and that creates that re-exacerbates the tensions that we talked about previously, right? Where you've got this labour movement which is, shaped by a mass membership with egalitarian values of social justice, and you just can't reconcile this kind of aggressive imperialist warfare You know, the kind of the horrible military tactics that were used, the detention and torture in places like Abu Ghraib and Bagram and Guantanamo, the backing of dictators all across the Middle East throughout this process. They can't reconcile that with their principles, and it's their party that's doing it. And I mean, we don't need to expand on the point, but it's worth just noting that, you know, this plays a major role in setting the scene for Corbyn later on. You know, in the sense in which the right wing of the party were morally discredited due to their complicity in the war on terror, and how Corbyn could say, well, I didn't support that.
Let's talk about Corbyn, actually, because as you've laid out, there is a tension within the kind of ideological and practical project that Labour has embodied. On the one hand, kind of enlightened principles. On the other hand, the kind of violence that is practically necessary in order to wield state power as it does. And usually someone like Corbyn would be consigned to yelling from the backbenches indefinitely. And according to, a lot of observers, even at the time, it was his kind of internationalism and his foreign policy, particularly even more so than his, wanting to nationalize things, et cetera, that kind of condemned him to the role of traitor, basically.
Yeah, I'll go along with that to a degree. There is a kind of, from certain centre-left people, being in a state of denial about the extent to which they were really signed up to the economic aspects. And they will trot this out as though to say, oh, we were fine with the domestic stuff. Mm-hmm. It was just the fact that you love Hamas and Putin that we couldn't bear. But actually, the domestic stuff is fine.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. If the domestic stuff had been fine, they would have proposed it. They had plenty of time to do that, and they didn't. They hated it. So I think there's a bit of disingenuousness going on there. Nevertheless, I mean, I think it really was, there's something particularly kind of provocative to the British political class about Corbyn on foreign policy. When you look at the actual policies, when you look at the two manifestos, the interesting thing is that they're not radical on foreign relations, really.
Yeah.
Like, we will continue to be part of NATO. I think it says we will continue to spend 2% of GDP on the military. We will have Trident. So all that stuff was there, like highly objectionable stuff from the point of view of people like us. But, that stuff was there. And in terms of, Corbyn was someone who would stress, we talked about those liberal institutions, the UN, international law, rules-based international order. He just took that stuff seriously, as in applying to everyone, not rules for...
So bless him. It's kind of, it's adorable, but also deeply objectionable at the same time.
But like these rules don't just apply to others, they apply to us too, which is obviously deeply offensive. And from the point of view of these people who really didn't like it. And so, it's worth just mentioning that in terms of formal policy, there was nothing radical about him. But I think because he was a critic of Western power, and I think this is a difficult thing for them, he was a critic of Western power. The whole myth that the West is a benign force for good in the world is punctured by the sort of critique that people like Corbyn make. And people who have their identity, I think, invested in a whole sort of chauvinistic view of Western civilization, chauvinistic view of British history, a chauvinistic version of British patriotism or whatever. They can't stand stuff like this, critiques like this. It goes right to their identity of, who they are as a British person, as a Westerner, et cetera, et cetera. And there's something they find particularly aggravating about these kind of criticisms of things like Iraq, about people talking too much about the Palestinians, about the invasion of Iraq, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also, what would an anti-imperialist do in 10 Downing Street as the Prime Minister of a country which is still imperialist?
It's kind of a Zen koan, what what sound does a tree make when it falls alone in the forest, etc., etc. It feels just kind of like very strategically and ideologically strange to even be in a position to be asking that question, right? Rather than just pulling the plug out the back and shutting the whole thing down.
Yeah. So perhaps, while the formal policies were not radical, there was a sense in which we can't trust you not to go further if you have the opportunity to do so. If you won a significant majority, if you got a second term, you might feel emboldened to go further. This played a major role. And of course, the thing you say about, that being a traitor, being in league with our enemies, I mean, that's a key element of the demonisation of the entire thing, And, I don't want to say that Corbyn was faultless. Far from it. I don't think he was cut out to be a leader. But demonisation is something else. This was just wild. It was feral, this campaign, to turn him into something, in the public eye that he clearly wasn't. Number one, as a traitor in league with our demonised enemies. And against us, the exalted West, the exalted British. And also this kind of, and this dichotomy happens so often, at once demonic and, dangerous, like terrorist sympathiser, on the other hand, a woolly pacifist. Like he was somehow both simultaneously. He was in love with terrorists, but he was also a pacifist who wouldn't even press a nuclear button. That kind of test that politicians have to go through at election time, which I'm sure future historians will look back on it. They had this archaic martial tradition where they had to pledge genocide before they could enter 10 Downing Street. He wouldn't do that. And so there's this element of kind of soft masculinity of his, which is completely at odds with the machismo of British state power and British militarism. And there's also this kind of sympathising with the people in the global south, which is suspect and such and such. And so you can see how all of this built into the demonisation and the othering of not just Corbyn, but the entire movement around him. So in that case, in that sense, it was important, It wasn't the only thing by any means, but it was important.
Let me encircle myself with salt to protect myself against the inevitability of raising the spectre of Keir Starmer. So what does sort of the modern Labour Party, right, the contemporary Labour Party's relationship with these key geostrategic questions, not least, as we're recording, the question of Israel and of Palestine, particularly of Gaza, tell us about how they imagine the UK's geostrategic interest? Like, what are they trying to prove when they're proving that they are the big boys who can be trusted with state power? Because it does seem like there's a little bit of a different flavour here. They're not quite so much going in hard with a Blairite liberal humanitarian intervention, right? There seems to be something a bit more kind of, I don't know, cynically, like, quote unquote, pragmatic about it, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we're not in that moment of liberal centrist hyper-confidence that we were in the 1990s. So we're not going to get this kind of aggressive approach to neoliberal economics. We're not going to get this aggressive approach to foreign intervention. I think that because, the historical conditions aren't conducive to any of that. But what we do have in this moment from the Labour point of view is that kind of a sense of restoring the Labour Party. When Keir Starmer, you notice he said the Labour Party is back as the representative of the working class, he keeps saying. Let's not get sidetracked by that.
Yeah,
it's incredible. It's so aggravating, and I'll talk about it for an hour if you let me, and it will, mostly be swear words. So what he's really saying, put aside that phrase, but the project is the Labour Party is back as a reliable part of the system. The Labour Party is back as a reliable set of managers of the status quo. The Labour Party is back as a reliable ally of the United States. The Labour Party is back as a reliable partner for British capital. The Labour Party is back as a reliable interlocutor with the gutter press and with Fleet Street more generally. That's what it is. The Labour Party is back as a fundamentally conservative force, small c conservative force, and conformist force in British politics. That's what this is all about. And that manifests itself in all different kinds of ways. In terms of Gaza, I think, well, you could see at the beginning of this genocide was the overarching priority for them in their interviews in those first few weeks was signalling, and this is not just to voters, it's to all those power centres that I mentioned. We're back, we're with you, you can rely on us, we're supporting Israel. And, you know, if you think about Starmer's infamous interview with LBC, where Nick Ferrari says to him, does Israel have the right to cut off water, cut off power to Gaza? If you think about his full answer, people focus understandably on the bit where he says, I think Israel does have that right. The wider thing, the wider, fuller answer is where he says, I don't want to step away from the core principle, words to that effect, that kind of corporate language. I don't want to step away from the core principle of signalling our support for Israel's right to self-defense. That's what's really happening. Mm-hmm. And so if you ask him a question which might elicit an answer that sounds as though he's betraying the forces that he's trying to ally himself with, you know, which questions the way Israel is acting, then his instinct is to push back against that, you know. And if you remember that whole round of interviews, people like Thornberry, people like Lamy, they were refusing to condemn what were obviously war crimes.
Yeah.
You know, the deliberate use of starvation as a war tactic, the collective punishment stuff, all the stuff that's been cited by the chief prosecutor to the International Criminal Court in his application for arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the Prime Minister and Defence Minister of Israel. Those war crimes and crimes against humanity were the ones that Keir Starmer said Israel had the right to commit, and were the ones that Thornberry and Lamy refused to condemn or refused to object to, or refused to recognise as war crimes. And a big part of that is they want to signal that we are back as reliable partners to Washington and to the British foreign policy establishment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if that means giving political cover to people committing genocide, if that means giving political cover to war crimes, to collective punishment, then we're perfectly prepared to do that. And later, when we're called on it, pretend that we didn't do that. You know, I think that's what's going on in that moment.
Is it useful to kind of drive a wedge in between or make differences between the foreign policy priorities of Labour and the Tory party, particularly in terms of what seems to be kind of differing imaginaries of what Britain's role on the world stage looks like, right? Brexit is the big looming question here, but also it's sort of talking about Tufton Street's imagination of a kind of renewed Commonwealth and the role of the US, the role of Europe more generally. So how can we start to broker differences, if we can at all, between Labour and the Tories?
Yeah, I mean, so the Conservative Party has clearly been kind of an increasingly malfunctioning as a governing party. You know, I mean, if we've been talking throughout this about Labour as one component part of the British state, a collection of managers that rotates in and out of government according to election results. And the Tories are obviously the other half of that, and the extent to which their base has kind of gone down certain intellectual kind of political rabbit holes in terms of, just right-wing nationalism. I mean, you always have to reconcile, in both parties, the instincts of the leadership and the instincts of the base, and the Conservatives have lost control of that sort of process or that job, it seems to me. And so things like Brexit, which, if you think about these parties as managerial parties of a wider set of power, wider power structure, wider set of interests, like Brexit doesn't really serve the interests of, we can't talk about British capital in general terms because it's diffuse, but it's not really what British business as a whole wanted. It's certainly not what the city wanted. It's not what the US wanted. And so Labour has the opportunity, which it is trying to take, to, as I said, to say to British business in its various forms, to say to the City of London, to say to the Americans, well, these guys have kind of, gone off the rails a little bit, but we can come in now and you can trust us. And, this the thing that left shitposters used to say, Capital's B team, to describe the Labour Party. This is literally it, I mean, it's not just Capital's B team, it's the US's B team, it's, the B team of the wider power structure. We're ready to come in now and, hold the fort, until it's almost implicit now, hold the fort until the A team is ready to come back. But I think when you look at, in terms of foreign policy, the sort of things that David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, stresses is the sort of things which I mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of this transitional phase into neo-imperialism, the rules-based international order and all institutions that go with that, and rules-based international order with that really heavy caveat, which is the rules don't apply to us, but still like a kind of regulated way of managing international relations between major states in their interests as capitalist states, right? We're going to play by those rules. We're going to be reliable partners within, within those frameworks. We're going to have good relations with our European neighbours, in no small part because that's what the Americans want. We're going to be reliable partners in all of this. And so, yeah, I mean, if you look at Lammy's speeches, he talks a lot about it. It is framed in terms of this liberal institutionalism. You can trust us. Again, it's the restoration of the Labour Party as a reliable component part of the governing system.
So as you've mentioned, part of the process of telegraphing suitability to wield the levers of power within the British state, within a colonial system specifically, is the party's capacity to discipline the left, not least because if the left is going to join any major party in Britain, it's probably going to be the Labour Party, right? So particularly in the shadow of, say how the party has treated, left-wing or critical figures like Faisal Shaheen, Diane Abbott, people like this, there's the question of what now, right? How does an anti-racist left, an internationalist left engage with the Labour Party at all? Is that even a sensible question to ask?
Yeah, so I think as sort of socialists of colour, anti-imperialists of colour, anti-racists of colour, we're in quite an invidious position with regard to Labour if we were to stay in it. I mean, I left ages ago, but those who remain are in quite a difficult position. We've talked earlier about the tension between the kind of supposed founding values of Labour, well, not just supposed, I mean, they're there amongst many people within the party in terms of egalitarianism, social justice, etc., on the one hand. On the other hand, being one of the two governing parties of a capitalist, imperialist kind of system with all the inherent iniquities and forms of violence inherent in that. Now, if you're a person of colour in Britain, it's not a given that you're going to have the sort of politics I described. But it's quite likely, or it's disproportionately likely. Like, okay, you might be a Rishi Sunak, you might be a Suella Braverman, you might be a Priti Patel, but fundamentally, it's, you're likely to have either yourself experience of living under colonial rule, or more likely your parents or grandparents did. Your whole position in society has been structured by the legacies of empire, right? In terms of class, for one thing, in terms of how racial capitalism works. Your experience of white supremacy is itself a legacy of empire. The attitudes that you've faced, the racist abuse you might have faced, the police violence you might have faced, the forms of exploitation you might continue to face. And when you see colonial violence in the rest of the world, whether it's in Iraq or in Palestine or Afghanistan, it's going to resonate to some degree because if you know your history, and you may well do because your parents or grandparents may have taught you it, or you might have been more conscious of it because of who you are, you will recognise those forms of violence from things that happened to your own forebears, I mean, I don't want to flatten differences and say that what's happening in Gaza is like, you can see it everywhere because it's got its own particularly unique characteristics. But there are things we see there which we can see in many instances, this collective punishment, going to war against a non-state actor, paramilitary, by just attacking the entire population, devastating their ability to live, collective punishment in the hope they turn against the paramilitary group. I mean, we see that everywhere. The British did that time and time again. It happened under Labour time and time again. So if you're a person of colour, you will recognise that stuff and you will have certain positions. You're more likely to have solidarity with Palestinians. You're more likely to be challenging, these kind of foreign relations generally. And you come up against the Labour leadership, which is doing the things that we described. And so this McCarthyism, the sharp edge of that is going to cut against people of colour disproportionately. Not exclusively. There'll be people of colour within the Labour Party who are happy to go along with the whole thing. But, I mean, if you think about the anti-genocide marches that many of us have been on in the last 8 months, you look at who's on those marches. These are the most diverse marches I've ever been on in 20 years of going on marches. Huge proportion of people of colour, huge proportion of British Muslims. That McCarthyism to drive out the wrong kind of people from the Labour Party is going to be racialised. And so when you see what happened with Faiza Shaheen, for example, some people say, it was nothing political, it's just because she was a person of colour or because she was a British Muslim, or other people saying, the other way around. Well, really, it's both. She could have been politically someone who didn't get pushed out because she just conformed to whatever the leadership wanted. But because of who she is, someone with a background in her family background in the colonies in Pakistan and Fiji, a British Muslim, a woman of colour, she was disproportionately likely to have the politics that she does in fact have, her authentic politics. And she was disproportionately likely to come up against this kind of cruel McCarthyism that she was subjected to. And we saw the toll that took on her personally in the Newsnight interview that she gave the day that she was deselected. And so we are in that invidious position. Is it healthy for us as socialists of colour, anti-imperialists of colour, anti-racists of colour, to be in a party which not only which is led by people who genuinely despise us and hold us in contempt, who will demand that we either forego our authentic politics or get out of the party, and who will happily broadcast to the wider country quite loudly that we are bad people who deserve to be driven out of British politics. I don't think that's sustainable in terms of having a positive, forward-looking, consequential politics that we can pursue as anti-racist, anti-imperialist, socialist people of colour. I don't see that there's a space in that party. I understand why people want to continue contesting it. But I think, going forwards, we live in the two-party system, and that's always been the reason why we've been almost forced to get involved with the Labour Party. But that two-party system was broken once under certain historical conditions. And I just wonder, in the face of climate catastrophe, in the face of complicity with genocide, whether a similar set of historical conditions might be emerging, whereby a party could emerge to Labour's left, and even if that's not particularly promising, it's more promising than people being expected to go through what Faiza Shaheen went through, which no one should have to go through.
So there, with the glimmering hope of a organised form of politics in Parliament that is not the contemporary Labour Party, that's probably where we'll have to leave it. David, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. It's been extremely enlightening.
Not at all, my pleasure.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support.